Welcome back, everybody, to our next episode of Carnivore Roundtable. This is the first time we've had a guest speaker on to join us, and his name is J Gulinello from New York City. Jay is an ISSA certified personal trainer with a specialty in fitness nutrition, a graduate of the Nutritional Therapy Association, and is now finishing his clinical master's program in human nutrition. Jay is currently stationed in a New York City hospital, educating doctors and nurses in the field on how to better improve nutrition, sleep, and stress management with a focus on performance and longevity. His independent research focuses on nutrition seen through an evolutionary and ancestral lens. He is with us today to help us unpack the deeply ingrained mythology that surrounds the topic of dietary fats, cholesterol, and the use of statins. Jay, we would love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself. So please.
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. That's quite the bio. I wonder who wrote that. So I started my journey probably about 10 years ago, around the same time that I moved to New York. Originally was a performer, so a musician and an actor, traveled around playing in bands, was a recording studio artist as well. That's how I ended up in New York, actually, originally, and then basically had to make money. So I became a personal trainer and quickly realized that nutrition was a huge part of this. And so I started doing some independent research and did some self-experimentation with fasting and low-carb ketogenic diets until one day I showed up at my doctor's office with an alarming blood test, let's say. Up until that point, my doctor was looking at me as the picture of health. And so this one particular lipid panel comes back and, kind of threw everything out of whack to the point where he actually accused me of being on drugs. I mean, that was actually the phone call I got was, now this man has my blood and my urine. So if I was on drugs, you would think that he would know that. But he straight up accused me of doing drugs because he said, and I quote, "No dietary intervention could possibly change blood lipids like that." And I think that was probably the moment that I realized, well, this guy apparently doesn't know a lot about nutrition, because it did. And so that sort of started some independent research, which led me to NTA, which led me to a master's program. And now I'm just unraveling this ball of yarn that is dietary fat, cholesterol, and heart disease, and what causes it, and what we can do going forward.
Great. And everyone here knows who we are, but just for fun, let's go through and introduce ourselves again, just so if we have any new observers that they know a little bit about each one of us. So as I said, I'm Cait. I'm a functional nutritionist just outside of Toronto, and I've been eating primarily ancestral animal-based for about 4 years.
I'm Alicia. I'm from Toronto. I am just a regular person with a passion for health and nutrition, and I have been following a low-carb diet for the past 3.5 years, and I've been more animal-based for the past 1.5 years.
Okay, my name is Vajid. I am a medical doctor, and I have a big passion for disease prevention using nutrition and lifestyle. And I guess these days I've been doing strict carnivore, but transitioning to something called the Paleolithic ketogenic diet. And just on that note, I'll do our little disclaimer as usual. So this is not supposed to be medical advice. Everybody's got an individual situation, so make sure you consult with your clinician before any major changes in your diet. But we're just hoping our experience, knowledge, and whatever evidence we know about will maybe help you make some better choices for your future health for the rest of your life.
Cool. And we're the Meters. I'm Petra.
And I'm Daniel.
And we've been eating an animal-based diet for the past year or so, a little bit over a year.
All right, let's dig into this because there is a ton to unpack. So we're gonna just start nice and easy. The question I think all of us get the most in social media land, and then I can definitely say that I get clinically, is, isn't saturated fat bad for you? I'm sure we all have something to add to that, but Jay, we would really love to know what your opinion is on that question.
Sure. I think it makes sense on the surface, like if you stand out on a street and you look down the road and you say, it certainly makes sense that the earth is flat, except, when you have perspective, you realize that's actually not the case. And so I kind of look at saturated fat the same way. And I actually I pulled 3 quick studies that I would just kind of give you the results of, because I think what's interesting about them is they span all the way back from 1968 all the way up to 2015. So this has been well documented in the literature for a long time. And I think maybe sometimes people think it's just fact, that saturated fat is bad for you. And that's just sort of, if you don't believe that, maybe you're even looked at as a little bit of an outlier. But the facts are actually a little bit different. So the Minnesota coronary experiment was from 1968 to 1973. And interestingly enough, the lead on this study was Ansel Keys, who is the gentleman who brought us the diet heart hypothesis. And what was interesting about this is that he actually buried the results. He never published the results of this because he was trying to prove that saturated fat caused heart disease. And what the result of the study showed, that actually it was the complete opposite. And the British Medical Journal uncovered this information in 2015. So basically, the available evidence from the randomized controlled trials show that replacement of saturated fat in the diet with corn oil effectively lowers serum cholesterol, but does not support the hypothesis that this translates to a lower risk of death from coronary heart disease. Actually, there was a 22% higher risk of death for every 30 milligram per deciliter or 0.78 millimole reduction in serum cholesterol. So that goes all the way back to 1968. If you look more recently, 2003 to 2013 was the PURE study. It was 135,000 participants. They actually found that a high carbohydrate intake was associated with a higher risk of total mortality, whereas total fat and individual types of fat were actually related to a lower mortality. They actually said global dietary guidelines should be reconsidered in light of these findings. And then finally, in 2015, a systematic review, which is the top of the evidence totem pole, found that saturated fats are not associated with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, ischemic stroke, or type 2 diabetes. So I would say that saturated fat in context of a healthy diet, in other words, nature tends not to put fats and carbohydrates together. We tend to do that in our own version of food. And so that's where maybe saturated fats could become a problem, but in and of themselves, in their natural state, so to speak, the evidence doesn't support it. And from what I think I've seen personally from clients, and I'm sure all of you will have some input on this, it doesn't seem to be that's the case. It's only when we combine these in a sort of unnatural manner that they tend to be problematic.
Cait, you're muted, I think.
Thank you.
No problem.
I was just going to say, I couldn't agree more, could not put it better. It's a really simple, easy way for people to sort of understand that, yes, we definitely don't typically have saturated fat and carbohydrates ever in a natural diet. It's impossible to find a food that combines both. So that is totally man-made. So yeah, great. Does anyone have anything else to add to that?
Well, there were a couple articles I read. There's a website, the dietdoctor.com. He's a Swedish doctor, Andreas something, I forget his name, but they've really nicely laid out kind of the history of fat and saturated fat. And they touch on, actually, a lot of the studies that you mentioned are in that article. So maybe we can link those in the description to the video. But yeah, basically, when you're looking at all those outcomes, they said, at worst, saturated fat is like a neutral fat. Like there's nothing to show that it actually is harmful in terms of outcomes, like you were talking about, like mortality and stuff like that. And there's even like a BMJ, I think a meta-analysis in the fall that was showing that, this is not directly saturated fat related, but they were showing that patients with higher levels of cholesterol, they actually had less mortality, like less of them were dying from, it was heart attacks and heart failure. And that was like 14,000 patients. So it's kind of interesting when you look at the evidence a bit closer that it's maybe not as bad as we've made it out to be for the last few decades.
And I think people have different responses to saturated fat as well. I actually happen to be a hyper responder. So my body, for whatever reason, responds very dramatically to increased fat intake, which is exactly what happened to me when I got these blood results. They didn't change in an unfavorable way. They just changed in a dramatic way. But I have clients who go to a sort of a paleo ketogenic type diet, whose blood lipids barely change at all, but they do budge in the what would be, considered the positive direction. Saturated fat and exercise are two of the most potent ways to raise HDL levels. A lot of doctors will tell you exercise, but not a lot of them will tell you saturated fat, because there's that paradox, right? Well, yes, it will raise your HDL, but it would also kill you. So you really shouldn't do that. So I think once you start to unpack that, it becomes clear that it's not directly related to heart disease, but everyone does have a slightly different response to it. So I don't advocate for people shoving truckloads of butter into their coffee in the morning because they want to be in the ketogenic club. I don't think that's necessarily the wisest way to go about it. If it's a transition that helps you get used to fats being healthy, that's fine, but I wouldn't rely on it as a lifestyle.
Jay, can we just talk a little bit about what a hyperresponder is? Because I think there's probably a lot of people out there that have never heard that term before, and we'd love to get your interpretation of it.
Sure. So the first time I ever heard this was, so after I got these results, I actually had to fire my doctor, because clearly I couldn't work with someone who wasn't interested in learning. And that's just the vibe that I got from him after we had a conversation. So I actually started traveling around the country to different conferences and listening to people speak, reading research that I had no business reading, because I was just completely, it was like another language to me at that time. But the first time I ever heard about it was, I think 4 years ago. Dave Feldman was the first person to highlight the term lean mass hyperresponder. And basically it was somebody who, when they ingest cholesterol, their body tends to be more responsive to it. So typically we make about 80% of the cholesterol in our body endogenously. The liver produces it and the brain produces its own cholesterol. So for most people, the cholesterol you eat doesn't have a dramatic impact on lipid levels. But for some people, and it seems to be the leaner, more athletic people tend to have these hyper responses to cholesterol. And again, it doesn't necessarily indicate ill health. It's really actually, the ratios actually go in a favorable direction, but the overall numbers, which is what happened to me, so the total cholesterol and the LDL, low density lipoprotein, those numbers really skyrocketed, but everything else moved in a very favorable direction. So the question then becomes, do we look at this one number and say, well, this number is bad, so in lieu of every other positive metabolic marker, they all must be wrong because we know that this number indicates poor health? Or could it be that we just have a misunderstanding of this one number, and in fact, in conjunction with all the other positive metabolic markers, that maybe this number isn't what we thought it was? So a hyperresponder is someone who tends to have exaggerated lipid results from the uptick in fat in the diet.
Thank you.
Jay, I had a question for you. Just if you could, like this change in your blood work, well, what was your diet like that led to this happening? Maybe I missed it when you said it earlier. I'm just curious what you were doing at the time that caused that to happen.
So I had just basically gone, I kind of did what I told people not to do, which was go full keto. I was putting butter, I was showering in butter. I was doing everything with butter. I mean, it was just,
Yeah.
But so, so it's kind of why I don't like labels and slogans, because I think they tend to pin us into a corner, and then we get stuck thinking, well, I'm keto, so obviously I have to put a truckload of butter in my coffee every morning. And so that's what I was doing. But that introduced me to sort of the idea. And then I slowly started to return to reality and think, this probably isn't super consistent evolutionarily and, ancestrally. So I started to back off on that. But yeah, I basically went from 0 to 60. I went from, I kid you not, from a truly low fat dietary guidelines, grain-based, I bought low fat Oreo cookies and thought, I'm a health nut. These are reduced fat. I mean, of course it's, to putting, grass-fed butter in like maybe some 300 to 400 calories every morning, and then having breakfast, and then, and just totally overdoing it. And so, yeah, so I really went, like I said, 0 to 60, and my liver and my gallbladder and everything were just a little bit unhappy, I think.
And so, I mean, what prompted you to make that dietary change? Like, did you have some health struggles, or was there some kind of journey along the way that led you to keto? Because I think a bunch of us here experienced that, and that's what led us to maybe like low carb, animal-based eating.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, honestly, that's what I see with most people. And I am an outlier in that, is that I never had any health issues. I just decided, I started with intermittent fasting. I don't even, honestly, I wish I could remember how it started. I feel like it just was a typical rabbit hole on YouTube one day, and one video went to another, and that algorithm really sucks you in. And I said, wow, this really seems interesting. And so I just started intermittent fasting, just very simply. I hadn't made any changes. In fact, I vividly remember I spent a month in Los Angeles when I was doing intermittent fasting, but I was not eating low carb or ketogenic, because I remember going to the grocery store and buying a loaf of bread. So I was still really eating the same diet I had always eaten. I was just incorporating intermittent fasting. But as you all know, intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets, one tends to find the other. If you start on one, you end up progressing to the other, and vice versa. So I think that's really how it happened. I honestly didn't have, most people do have some kind of event or some kind of personal issue that pushes them in that direction. And I really didn't. I just, for the love of research, and I just am like I'm the perpetual guinea pig. I just love to see what happens when I do this. And that's kind of really how it happened.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because like for me, I did have like my cholesterol was going up. I was prescribed a statin, which I didn't take. But yeah, I went through the same path. Like the first sensible thing I tried was intermittent fasting, and then I did keto. And I really think that your approach to this, like I think you have to be your own human guinea pig in a way. Like for the most part, I mean, unless you have some serious medical problems, trying a diet for like 30 days, 90 days, not much can really go wrong, but it'll really give you information for the rest of your life as to whether it works, whether it makes you feel better. You can get some blood work done and see objectively what's going on. And I really think that if we all wait till modern medicine and science figures out, the holy grail diet for everybody, we might be dead by the time that happens. Like it could be decades, right? We don't have time. Yeah. So I totally hear you on that.
Yeah, self-experimentation. I encourage everybody to do it. I don't believe there's a one size fits all. I think that maybe once upon a time when we all lived sort of and evolved where our ancestors came from genetically, we were adapted to that environment. We were adapted to the foods that would grow seasonally. And so it probably made a lot more sense at that time. But now that we have moved literally across the globe, you see that with, reduced vitamin D levels. That probably was a physical adaptation to that environment, at the time. And now we see people moving to a northern latitude who once upon a time lived closer to the equator. And so I think the same thing happens with nutrition, right? So I think you have to be relentlessly interested in self-experimentation, or you're never really going to get there with any one-size-fits-all approach. I know that's a cliche, but it's absolutely true. But it is what we try to do with dietary guidelines, isn't it? To create a one-size-fits-all approach for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. And I just have one more thing to add, then I'll let other people take a turn. But you said something earlier that really resonated with me. Like I'm in this group chat with a bunch, like hundreds of other doctors, and I'm fairly open about diet for prevention of disease. So they know I'm on the carnivore diet, and everybody was like, oh, isn't saturated fat bad for you? Oh, your LDL is going to go up. And I just said, hey, like, if this is the diet that allows me to stick to, a diet, and I get in shape, like I, lose weight, lose body fat, my blood markers are all good. My inflammatory markers are low. I don't have hypertension. I don't have all the bad things that kind of go along with a lot of chronic diseases, but one marker, my LDL goes up. Isn't that trade-off worth it? I mean, you have a lowered risk for all sorts of diseases. And then even with LDL, there's that question of stratification. So, if you've got someone with like high triglycerides, low HDL, and high LDL, well, in that context, then maybe having a high LDL increases your risk for various diseases. But if it's the only thing that's up and all your other markers are good, like your HDL's up, your triglyceride to HDL ratio is low, then why would you go chasing that one lab marker? It's kind of like missing the forest for the trees, right?
I couldn't agree more. To me, it leads us to the inescapable conclusion that we have misunderstood that one lab value. I mean, even if you want to look at it in that terms, if you just want to say, well, if I have more if it's like a game, well, I have more metabolic markers in the favorable direction than I do in the negative. I mean, that's not how I look at it. But if you want to break it down into its simplest form, why would you bet the farm on this one simple metabolic marker that, again, like you said, I've seen it elevated in people that have ill health, and I've seen it elevated in people who are world-class athletes. And so I find that to be incredibly non-predictive, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. I think we're too focused on that one for sure.
We miss the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Well, what about dietary cholesterol? Like that's always the second thing that precedes the saturated fat question. And I mean, every single time I post anything on social media that has an egg in the picture, I immediately get the hordes of angry vegans and even just misinformed people that follow standard American diets, fearful of the amount of cholesterol that I'm consuming. Or many patients even will get a meal plan from me and be like, oh my God, there's like 12 eggs this week. Like, I'm going to die. So, like, how do we unpack that? How do we explain and to our viewers here, what is dietary cholesterol? How does it affect us? Is it beneficial? Is it negative? Help us understand.
Oh boy, how much time do we have? I mean, that's really the rabbit hole. That may actually be, the linchpin for me, where this all started and trying to understand it. And quite honestly, nobody has the answer. So let's just be upfront about that. So anybody that tells you they have all the answers is just simply lying, because there's just too much. There is no consensus amongst, the doctors, the scientists, even amongst the literature. You can read one paper that will point to one thing and one paper that will point to the other. But the fact I always come back to is that, again, we make most of our cholesterol endogenously, meaning the body produces it. So, and it's produced by the liver, and it really can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So the brain actually has to produce its own cholesterol. So it's such an important molecule. Literally, without cholesterol, we die. And we die. There is no question about it. It is vital for so many different functions, and we can talk about that if you want, about its function in immunity or its ability, it's actually, I think it's 25% of the dry wave of the brain, 30% of all cell membranes. It's 80% of the myelin sheath, which is the protective coating of the axons in the brain. I mean, this molecule is so incredibly important, and there's only one cholesterol. It's not good, it's not bad. There's one cholesterol molecule. What we talk about when we talk about HDL and LDL are actually lipoproteins that carry cholesterol through the body. So when people say good and bad cholesterol, you could say it's a semantic argument, but I think it's actually important to understand that there's just one cholesterol molecule. It's a 4-ring structure. Biochemically, it's one thing. So to label it good or bad, it's not very scientific, let's be honest, and it oversimplifies something that's incredibly complex. So you would have to believe then, if you think cholesterol is bad for you, that quite literally your liver and your brain are conspiring to kill you, because they produce most of the cholesterol that you have in your bloodstream. So I find that hypothesis comical, but it's not comical because it's cost people their lives, with unnecessary drug prescriptions. And I think one of the reasons we see dementia on the rise is because this obsession, this myopic obsession with lowering cholesterol at literally all costs. And we talk about statins later on, but the other diseases that are associated with statin use, all to drive cholesterol levels to this pathologically low place. But I mean, even vegans who do not consume cholesterol have cholesterol in their body. In fact, I have some vegans who have very high cholesterol. So how is that even possible? Well, because the brain and the liver both produce cholesterol, and I promise you, they are not trying to kill you.
Yeah, and there's no cholesterol in plant foods from what I understand.
Right.
You can only get it from animal foods.
Correct.
I think Dan and Petra, you guys had a question for Jay about like statins and cholesterol. So maybe, do you guys want to ask him that one?
Yeah, so I think it was a couple of months ago, I looked into cholesterol lowering medications just because I knew nothing about them, and I was starting to learn about cholesterol, and I discovered the terrible side effects. Like, one of them that stood out to me was the nerve damage. And I was just wondering if you had anything to share about the side effects. That would be pretty cool to listen to.
Sure. Nerve damage, muscle aches and pains are typical with statin use. Even there was a cohort called the METSIM cohort that showed it was like 8,500 patients aged 45 to 73 that showed an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, 46% risk of diabetes. Wow. I mean, that's shocking. And I actually have a client who had a 0 calcium score, so had no calcification in her arteries, was prescribed a statin because she had, high cholesterol. And I hate that term because I don't even know what it means. And so she developed pre-type 2 diabetes. And so she was an ND. She was a doctor, and she took herself off the statin because she said, well, there's no legitimate reason for me to be on this, and it's going to lead to type 2 diabetes. So I'm going to take myself off this. And so I would think, the nerve damage you're talking again about, these statin drugs can actually, they can cross the blood-brain barrier. Each of them can cross at a different level. But if they're interfering with the brain's ability to produce the myelin sheath, the protective coating of the nerves, you're going to have a serious problem with cognition. And again, I think that's why we see an uptick. They call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, and there's a direct relation to that pathology, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's. And so I think it scares me. It scares me because of how important cholesterol is. Again, it's about 30% of all cell membrane. So you're compromising cell membrane structure in every cell in the body when you artificially lower cholesterol levels. And I can also only imagine that on the back end of that is the liver is going to try to compensate. You're actually blocking an enzyme in the liver. That's what the statins do. So it has to be concerning to me to lower cholesterol, which literally is a global molecule that works everywhere in the body. So yeah, I mean, the side effects of statins blow me away, and not to get into the financial side of it, but the BMJ in 2018 put out an interesting paper that said by 2020, which is where we are now, the statin industry will be a $1 trillion industry. That's trillion with a T. So it's not conspiracy theory. It's just business,
Yeah.
But it is a business. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that it is the biggest business. And if cholesterol were to sort of be, if cholesterol were to be normalized, and it was sort of considered a normal physiological thing in the body, and it's not a problem, and we need to now look for the actual culprit of heart disease, I think a lot of things would change in that business world. And I think a lot of people are very resistant to that change. And I think that's part of the problem that you start to uncover, as you did when you start going down the rabbit hole of side effects. And very often the side effects are misrepresented. They'll use absolute risk and relative risk, and they'll sort of use them interchangeably in order to highlight the benefits and downplay the side effects, which is very dangerous. So when you're reading research, and this is what I had to learn the hard way, was you really have to understand those statistics. And that is something that, quite honestly, I'm not very good at. I didn't do very well in economics or statistics in high school. So, I struggle with that part of my education now, but it's vital, because otherwise you really can't read the scientific literature. You can't understand what it means.
Yeah. That's honestly so unfortunate. It makes me feel like a little bit hopeless that we'll ever get down to the root of the problem, knowing that it's a $1 trillion industry. That's scary.
We also got to be careful what we're saying before we might come after you, Jay.
Yeah.
It's okay. I have an undisclosed location.
Incognito, eh? Yeah.
There's enough going on in the world now. I think they're going to leave me alone for the time being.
Yeah, there you go.
We're slightly distracted at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, maybe on that note, we can look at some numbers. Jay, I know you have some, and I gave you my numbers as well from my most recent blood work.
Sure.
So do you want to share your perspective on that? Maybe we can talk about ratios and talk about the relevance of triglycerides to HDL to LDL and the whole picture. And I think what will be most helpful for people that are watching and listening is that, I see it in all the forums and Facebook groups, and especially with clients, again, where they bring blood work in and they're trying to interpret their lipid panel, and it is very difficult to interpret if you aren't experienced in doing so. So would love for you to help share that information so that people at home can do that themselves instead of relying on their doctors.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think, cholesterol levels, they can be extremely hard to understand, but I really, for people, I try to make it really, really simple, and you'll see how simple I try to make it. I mean, I literally throw out half the numbers and then I take the other two in the context with other things. Like I like to look at things like systemic inflammation, because that's telling me if the repair processes in the body are being outpaced by the damaging inflammatory processes in the body. So I want to know what's going on, in that sense. I want to know what blood sugars look like. I want to take those things, into context. And essentially, when I look at cholesterol, I really just look at the total cholesterol. I think it was Professor Ken Sakaris, who's an amazing pathologist. He said something, flip, like total cholesterol, completely useless. Just toss it out. It doesn't really mean anything, which I know for some people is really kind of shocking information because actually in my first semester in grad school, I did a research project on cholesterol and on lipids. And what I found out to my shock was total cholesterol is not even on the American Heart Association's risk matrix any longer. It doesn't even exist, which is not something I don't think, that people really know, because you still see foods that say low cholesterol, and, low cholesterol is considered good. And, but they have other markers like high sensitivity C-reactive protein. They have, they have inflammatory markers. So it seems like they're progressing in the right direction. They won't officially walk away from cholesterol, although in 2015, the US dietary guidelines did remove cholesterol as a nutrient of concern for overconsumption, which means they're basically telling people it doesn't matter how much cholesterol you eat. It's fine. Don't worry about it, which again, that's not really mainstream news. I mean, but that's in the 2015 dietary guidelines. So what I do really simply in the context of all those other things I mentioned, inflammatory markers, blood sugar levels, I just simply take triglycerides, which are a marker of energy in the system. So there's no good reason physiologically for there to be high amounts of energy in the system, because that tells us that energy is either being overconsumed or it's being underutilized. So we want triglyceride levels to be low, and then HDL, which high density lipoprotein, which participates in reverse cholesterol transport. So that's bringing cholesterol that's not needed anymore back to the liver for recycling, excretion in the bile, or for repackaging into other lipid molecules. So those two numbers basically exist in a ratio. So all I want to see is a 1-to-1 ratio at the most, or less. So I want to see the triglyceride number lower than the HDL number. So we want to see high HDLs, low triglycerides, and then quite honestly, it does not matter what LDL levels are and what total cholesterol levels are, because I've actually shown in some of my own blood tests, those numbers can vary dramatically within weeks of one another. Some people will tell you that, well, once you've made an intervention, you have to wait. I think my doctor once told me 6 months before you could, you'd be able to see any appreciable changes. And when I fired my doctor because of a blood results, I made a few changes. 3 weeks later, I was in a different doctor's office, got another set of blood tests, and in American units, it had changed like 80 milligrams per deciliter. So it was a huge change in the total cholesterol numbers. So that just shows you how malleable this is. When people have infections, when people recover from surgery, total cholesterol levels tend to increase because cholesterol is, again, required for cell membrane structure. So as the body goes into repair mode, it uses cholesterol as a building block. So the only two numbers that really matter to me, and there are several papers actually that point this out, where actually it was in the journal Clinics in 2008 said that the triglyceride to HDL ratio is the strongest association to heart disease. So that's the one I look at. That's the one a lot of pathologists look at. And as long as that ratio is 1-to-1 or less, in lieu of low insulin, low HbA1c, low inflammatory markers, I feel like I have a pretty good metabolic panel in front of me.
Yeah, just that's the one I've heard too is the most rock solid marker to look at, that ratio. And just, I know we've been kind of poo-pooing doctors a little bit, so I'm kind of stuck between two worlds, right? I went through the whole like traditional medical training, but then I've also kind of gone through this other stuff on my own outside of my medical training to try to sort out my own health issues. My own cholesterol was going out of whack apparently when I was 30. I know that like all my colleagues are very, very well intentioned, and like they're just a product of their training, right? It's like what we get taught in med school. Like we trust the medical education system to tell us what is most current, and I do believe they are doing their best to teach us that. So we get all these studies about statins and stuff, and we're told to prescribe them, and so people do. I think what maybe the focus needs to be in the future is to realize that even the amount of benefit that statins bring, like the percentage change in like whatever outcome, tends to be pretty small from what I understand from any of the research. And so people still prescribe them just to try to get that benefit. But I think the goal should be in the future to look at root cause and try to get people off these meds, like whatever is causing their blood work to go out of whack, or they're, having various, complications and diseases occur. The focus in the future should be on prevention and looking at diet as, the way to do that. I think that is something that needs to change with the medical education system. And I think you said something else that reminded me of this podcast I was watching. It was with Dr. Paul Saladino. Do you know him, like Carnivore MD?
Sure.
and he was talking to this interventional cardiologist, Dr. Nader Ali. I'll try to post the link in the description.
I met him actually recently. Yeah.
That cardiologist?
Nadir Ali? Yeah.
Yeah. So I really liked what he said. He said, we're kind of blaming, like we look at plaque in the wall of arteries, like the coronary arteries in the heart, and there's cholesterol in there. So we make this assumption that cholesterol is bad for us and that elevated cholesterol in the blood is bad for us based on that. But it's kind of like a faulty conclusion that we're jumping to. And he likened it to like blaming firefighters for the fire. Like maybe the cholesterol is there trying to repair the damage, right? Like you were saying, it's part of the immune response. It's part of what fixes a lot of things in the body. And we're kind of making cholesterol look bad when really it's trying to help us.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't possibly agree more. I think that's the exact analogy, and there are a bunch of really good ones out there, but the firefighter analogy is terrific. And if you want a really cool little super nerdy factoid, there was this really great paper done where they actually took cadavers, that had died of heart attacks, and they dissected the arterial plaques to actually figure out what the composition of the plaques were. And they were actually 68% fibrous tissue, so collagen essentially. 68% of the plaque was that. 8% calcium, 8% inflammatory foam cells. Only 16% was fat, was lipid. And of that 16%, 74% was unsaturated fatty acids. So, it's kind of unbelievable. So do we blame collagen for heart disease? Do we blame calcium for heart disease? I don't think so. I think people eat spinach because they love calcium. And I think people dump collagen in their coffee because they think it's helping them have beautiful hair, skin, and nails. But yet those things are found in somewhat a higher percentage in those arterial plaques. So we just have the equation wrong. And I to your point about the education, I think you're right. And I love the school that I go to because I feel like I'm fortunate. I have, fortunate and unfortunate that I have 2 textbooks for every class, because basically, one of the textbooks is the sort of traditional medical model. And this is pathology and this is how it works. And then there's a sort of functional medical perspective that I get. So I have to sort of try to differentiate this on exams, and I have to sort of remember what questions I'm answering, and am I supposed to be answering this the way I know it to be true or the way that people are taught it to be true. So, but I do get to see the other side of that. And I don't blame doctors necessarily. I think that it's important though to keep up with the literature, and I think that's where doctors should be blamed. That if you do have people's lives quite literally in your hands, I think then it is important and it's incumbent upon you to stay current with the literature, because it is dangerous. You can, a pharmaceutical rep comes in and says, this statin's going to, decrease heart disease risk by 36%. That seems pretty dramatic, and you want to save patients' lives. And so if that's the case, of course you're going to prescribe that statin. But if you don't have time in a busy practice to go look at that study and to realize that they're using absolute risk, are they using relative risk? What's, was the study sponsored by a drug company? And it's really difficult. And I would like to see a paradigm shift. I would also say long form conversations like this are an amazing educational tool for people. And the problem with sound bites on the news or headlines in a newspaper, they cannot possibly get to the answer. They just can't. And we see today, the flashier the headline, the more grotesque the headline, the more people, click on it. So when I try to explain it to people and I say, well, it's, there are fats that we need, but then, if you have them in the wrong ratios, and then of course, if you look at an arterial plaque and you dissect it, you actually see, and it's just not like people just zone out and forget about it. Is cholesterol good or bad? Bad. Okay, got it. That's why good, bad cholesterol. It makes so much sense. It's really easy, but formats like this and mediums like this are so important to getting the message to people where they can sit, listen. And I tell people all the time, I don't want to tell you what to think. I want to teach you how to think. And that's what I've had to do for myself. And I have had to relearn so many things, but I feel like I'm a much more complete practitioner and researcher because of it, because I'm constantly trying to challenge my own belief systems.
Yeah, for sure. I think like, we get taught to be like lifelong learners in medical school. So I think, you're right. After school, we should be going off on our own journeys and figuring things out. And mine was sort of triggered by my own selfish reasons because I had sort of things going kind of out of whack. But yeah, it is important for people to be open-minded and be able to say, oh, I was wrong, or we were taught wrong or something like that. And because you're right. I mean, like you were saying, that the absolute risk versus relative risk, they can polish things up in marketing, right, when they tell you about a drug. So I mean, if you've got a drug that has like a huge amount of like relative risk reduction, you know, it could be like a 50% decreased risk, but that could be just going from like 6% to 4% or something. I didn't probably do the numbers right in my head, but
no, you
know,
did though. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like a 2% to 1% reduction, you know, is absolutely a 1% risk reduction, but you could look at it as a 50% risk reduction as well.
Yeah. And
I
so
mean,
you
those
get
two
that,
numbers, it's completely different. You know what I mean? A completely different result to somebody's brain.
yeah. I mean, and like as MDs, like a lot of them are very busy with their own practices. They don't have a lot of time to like learn. They've got kids, they've got a home to take care of, they've got their own family and stuff like that. And so they maybe don't devote as much time as maybe I do. Like, I mean, I'll go down a rabbit hole on YouTube and just be listening constantly to try to get new information, but a lot of them are busy. So they get fed the marketing spiel, and, you know, that little 1% of actual risk reduction is not worth like all the side effects, you know, that we've been talking about. And you're very right. Like, we're giving planetary level, you know, dietary recommendations, like the whole Eat Lancet, you know, study based on correlational information. And we're just kind of, you know, giving that to everybody. And it's literally, it could be causing like countless people to lose limbs, lose their vision, lose their lives or prematurely. And it's scary to think how much, you know, responsibility people giving that message out actually have, and what the impacts could be, both negative and positive.
Yeah, the research world is scary in and of itself. I mean, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet, Dr. Richard Horton, had recently said something along the lines of that scientific literature, perhaps, I think he said half, may be untrue. And I think it was something like conflicts of interest, you know, confirmation bias, you know, all of these things. But this is the editor-in-chief of the Lancet telling us that half of the medical literature may be completely useless. I mean, that's downright scary. I mean, that means you either have to really be careful of what you read. I posted something recently about this really funny study that talked about canola oil being the healthiest oil on the planet. And when you scroll down to the conflicts of interest and you go over to the authors and everything, it's literally sponsored by the canola oil industry. Every single author, 100% of them, worked for the canola oil industry, and lo and behold, they found that canola oil was just so heart healthy. I mean, but, you know, so what do you exactly expect, you know, when you have those kinds of biases? I mean, you can't bite the hand that feeds you. Like you said, you have to feed your family. So I understand it, but I don't understand it because again, we're talking about people's lives and people who don't know any better. It's not the person's job on the street to know this stuff. I mean, I work on it every single day and I barely know it. So,
yeah.
so for somebody who has kids and two jobs or whatever, and a busy life, they just go to the supermarket, and if it says heart healthy or fat free, they buy it because they think they're doing, I mean, that's how I grew up. My mother, you know, I've changed her eating patterns now, but she, you know, always laughs. She's like, oh, I feel so bad for giving you, you know, rice cakes for when you were a kid and all these things that, you know, I thought I was doing the right thing, fat free. You know, we had margarine, you know, we had those things because we were trying to be healthy as kids. And so I give her credit though, because she was being health conscious. She just didn't have the right information. And that's really what I want. I just want people to have the right information and then to make their own determinations from there.
Yeah. And there are doctors that are coming around. Like, I've got a bunch of family doctor friends that are curious about carnivore diet, or at least they're learning about diet outside of their, you know, cardiology or family medicine training. And I even have one family doctor friend. He's actually a proponent of like plant-based diets. He follows Dr. Grieger and quotes a lot of his videos and studies that he quotes. And what's interesting is recently he had two patients that were kind of at the end of the line in terms of just being frustrated by like arthritis and a few other symptoms. I forget what they had, but he's put them on carnivore. So I'm really excited to see like what happens with his patients if they actually get better. So people are kind of coming around and realizing, hey, like maybe there's something else to this diet thing than what we get taught by, you know, medical school or residency training.
So often the diet we come from is the important part. And, you know, that's why vegan diets can work if you're eating, I mean, I don't think it's healthy long-term for a lot of reasons, but I think more importantly, initially it's where you're coming from. If you're coming from a standard Western diet, almost literally anything is going to be better for you. So, you know, which is why I try not to get trapped into the vegan carnivore, you know, I'm neither. But I think we evolved to be omnivores. I think that's actually quite clear in the biology, but when we become damaged, sometimes it's necessary to go to an extreme to sort of correct damage and then find a more livable middle ground. But where you come from dietarily is really dictates the outcomes very often.
For sure.
All right. Well, let's look at some numbers so that we can help everybody explore that.
Do you want me to pull up your blood work then, Cait?
Sure. If we want to look at mine, that's fine.
Or do we have Jay's also?
Jay,
I just have mine written down.
Okay.
It's okay. We can bounce between the two. It'll
Sure,
be
why not-
compare even yours versus mine and things like that. So
Sure.
Okay, I will share Cait's blood work in a second.
I will say too, you know, if you want to elaborate past the actual lipid panel, I do have inflammation markers and blood sugar numbers as well.
Sure. Right, so in the US, the total cholesterol in the US on the right side, 225 milligrams per deciliter, pretty sure that that would qualify you for a statin. Anything over 200 is considered, you know, bad. So immediately what I look at is I say, like I said, I pretty much throw out total and LDL, which is funny because again, that's sort of where most traditional medical practitioners will focus. I look for HDL levels. So those are really kind of perfect. I mean, I want something in American units, I want something above 60, yours are 85 or 2.21 millimoles. So that's great. And then your triglycerides, when you sent these to me originally, I actually thought it was a mistake because those are incredibly low, which means to me, you are truly utilizing your fuel source well, and there's no excess energy parked in the system, which is fantastic. So I probably should have done this conversion ahead of time, but I like to use like 100 milligrams per deciliter as the line of demarcation where I get worried about triglycerides, 100 to 130 in American units. Once it goes above that, and you're at 16 American units, so that's incredibly low. Mine personally, in my last check, were 60. So that would be 0.68 millimole. So still very low. Tells me that the energy parked in the system is totally fine. And that ratio, you know, there are quite a few calculators online that you can actually use that will give you your heart disease risk just based on that. And then I use things like the HOMA IR score, which is a calculation using a simple fasting blood glucose and a simple fasting insulin. And if I have a low triglyceride and a high HDL number, so again, that ratio being 1-to-1 or less, so the triglycerides are lower than the HDL, and I have a favorable HOMA IR score, so I've got low blood sugars, I've got low fasting insulin, I've got low HbA1c, and low inflammatory markers, I find it hard to, I would find it hard to warrant any kind of other intervention, especially a medical intervention. Now, dietarily, you know, I also ask a lot of, you know, how people are feeling. Sometimes it can take time for people to metabolically adapt to burning fat as a fuel source. That does, for some people, that does take time. Personally, for me, it actually didn't take very much time at all. I think I was sort of a natural fat burner. Just from, even when I was younger, I could never work out if I had eaten. So like I would go on long runs and I could only do it fasted. And I didn't even know what fasted really was when I was, you know, 16 years old, but I couldn't work out with anything in my stomach. So I think I just was always sort of in that mode. But some people find it to be, you know, they get brain fog or they sort of have some sort of, you know, physiological symptoms. But, you know, the thing about cholesterol is that you can't feel cholesterol, right? So you don't know unless you test. You don't really know what these dietary interventions are doing to the metabolic markers, which is what I discovered when I went to the doctor. I went in there thinking, I'm going to have a lipid panel just like this. I'm going to see, you know, I used to see how high I could get my HDLs, how low I could get my triglycerides, because I always knew that was really a favorable thing, even when I didn't know all the details. But when I went in there and I had a total cholesterol and an LDL that were through the roof. I mean, I can give you an example of mine, and I'll do it in both units. My total cholesterol was 313, which would have been 8.09 millimole. And actually, I've had quite higher. I've had close to 12 millimole as a total cholesterol number. And I had an LDL alone on this test of 5.77, which is 223 milligrams per deciliter. And it's been as high as 8, I think. I scared myself. I did, because I was really conditioned to think this is going to kill me. And I remember sitting on my couch the day after I got the blood results through email. I remember sitting there thinking every ache and pain in my chest was the heart attack, because that's how ingrained this is. It's like the placebo effect, you know? It's like I could walk around the rest of my life not knowing if I had high or low cholesterol, but the moment somebody tells me that my total cholesterol is 12 millimole, you know, per deciliter, per liter, I immediately start having chest pains. So again, I'll just go back and say, to make it really simple for people, you can just look at a triglyceride to HDL ratio. And what that's also going to tell you, the proxy for, is the size of the LDL particle. And I know we didn't really touch on that because that gets super nuanced. And to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of that is just kind of moving the goalpost. So originally, total cholesterol was the villain. And then when we realized total cholesterol really wasn't the villain, we kind of said, well, actually, we meant it was LDL that's actually the villain. And then we kind of realized, okay, well, it's actually just the small LDL that's actually the villain. And the truth of the matter is that when you look at it actually under a microscope, HDL particles are actually the smallest of all particles. They're actually smaller than the LDL particles. So if the theory is that LDL actually slips sneakily underneath the endothelial layer to start causing all this plaquing and all these problems, I would ask why HDL doesn't do it, because it's actually smaller than LDL. So, you know, but to not get too granular into that, I would just say that that ratio, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, will also put you in a favorable LDL size. So there's, you know, there's type A and there's type B. You want what's called the big, fluffy, buoyant, all those terms they use. And having a low triglyceride and high HDL ratio will put you in that category. So again, I look at this and I say metabolically healthy. And I know that's not the consensus amongst all practitioners, but that's what I look at. And that's what I see across the board in my healthiest clients. And even in lean clients, I could see the total opposite. You know, they look lean, they have a super unhealthy diet. And when I look at their blood, I can tell that they have a super unhealthy diet because I see sky high triglycerides, rock bottom HDL, and they may even have a total cholesterol that's totally normal. You know, like, again, 165, say, in American units, which, again, I'm sorry, I don't know what that would be millimole. I should have had they should make a handheld calculator.
There's an app idea for you.
Yeah, I should probably get that. But so, yeah, so, I mean, it's just very deceiving. So I think you do really have to test in order to understand.
And Cait, just for our new viewers that may be just tuning into this episode, maybe just in a nutshell, tell people what your diet is, because it's not a strict carnivore diet.
No, around the time that I would have had this blood work done, it would have been probably a little bit more strict than it is right now. But more, you know, we're splitting hairs really. Definitely more than 80% of my calories come from animal products, meat and eggs specifically, and then a little tiny bit of dairy here and there. And I would say most days it's actually much more than 80%, but there are some fermented foods in my diet, and some non-starchy vegetables. And then once in a blue moon, some more starchy carbs, like a bit of sweet potato or rice, but I could go months without eating anything like that. But just for full transparency. So definitely ancestral, grain-free, except for the rice once in a while. And yeah, very much primarily animal-based. Lots and lots of saturated fat.
Yeah.
So I would say you're not a hyper-responder.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's very similar to my diet as well. 95% animal-based. When I honestly really do listen to my body. When I go in the grocery store and I see asparagus or Brussels sprouts and they're calling my name, I buy them and I bring them home and I saute them in ghee or olive oil and I salt them. And that's another thing that's not bad for you, salt. And so I do that, and it's great. So I definitely try to listen to my body. And I think once you've liberated yourself from that blood sugar roller coaster and your hormones are really balanced and satiety becomes hormonally driven instead of blood sugar driven, you can then trust those instincts and you can eat according to those instincts. Whereas most people on a Western diet, they have to eat every 2 hours because they're constantly in hypoglycemic crisis.
Yeah, and the only people that I would say that maybe that's not the best idea or approach for are people that really struggle with carb addiction.
Sure.
So anyone who, you know, if you're addicted to carbs. So yeah, if you're really trying to break that cycle, it's no different than breaking up with a relationship that's, alcohol based. If you have an abusive alcoholic relationship or drug relationship, it is literally no different. The brain replies in the exact same way. So for anyone out there that's watching this that is really struggling in that department, I would keep it dialed in as strict as possible for as long as possible to really reprogram those pathways. But yeah, just like Jay said, for anyone who's sort of healed that metabolic situation or hormonal situation, you should really be robust enough to handle some vegetables. And you know, really at that point, it's like choice, whether you want to bring them back in or keep them out.
Yeah, I tell people once you learn the rules, you can break them.
Yeah, for sure. And once you actually know what your own signaling is.
Right.
And there's a spectrum too, right? I mean, from the sources that I've been looking at, you know, some plant matter is a bit worse for you than others. I mean, I think things like legumes and grains typically tend to be some of the ones that provide the least benefit and maybe the most harm. And then there's other things, like I've heard squash is not so bad for you. Certain fruits, I mean, I'm just saying this off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, there's, again, it's not like they're all bad, and it's not like a black and white thing. You know, it's very individual and sort of depends on what choices you make as far as plant products.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Seasonally, I try to tell people to eat seasonally. You know what? You know, eating blueberries 365 days a year is probably not, you know, terribly consistent with evolution, and it probably is not going to work great for most people. So yeah, absolutely.
And you guys mentioned something about like just people having like addictions to carbs and like being hungry and eating every 2 hours. Like I can speak to that because that used to be me, and I haven't really read anything about this. This is just my own theory, but I wonder how much of that is like a physiologic hunger just because you're not really giving your body the vitamins and minerals, you know, and essential nutrients that you really need. So it's like you keep eating the junk food that's just empty food. It doesn't have any of that stuff. And so your body continues to drive you to seek out more food to fulfill those essential nutrient requirements, but you never really do. So you're just always hungry. And what I find crazy about this diet is within a few days of switching to this diet, like my hunger just disappeared. I find that it's very, very predictable now, and very, very easy to manage. So I mean, I would love to see the science behind that, but I wonder if that's maybe the case for a lot of people when they eat a more nutritious diet.
I think there's a lot to that. I often think that macronutrients aren't really what fill you up. It's the micronutrients, and your body will drive you to eat if it needs certain micronutrients. And obviously you're unaware of them, but the body knows exactly what it's lacking and what it needs. So I've seen people eat plenty of calories and not be satiated. And I know myself that if I sit down with enough steak and literally nothing else, there comes a point where I'm done, and I know it. So it's really interesting, but I think that does play into it. I think, you know, the micronutrient component is very undersold, underplayed, and I think it's really incredibly important.
Yeah, for sure.
Alicia or Dan or Petra, do you guys have anything to add, like even if it's experienced in your own bodies in regards to any of that? Like maybe even when you switched from like your standard diet to your low carb diet, like did you have those same sort of changes in hunger and things like that? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I was going to say, I can speak to that. I absolutely experienced that when I was following a standard Western diet. I was very much always focused on what my next meal was going to be. I was driven by food, and it really took over a lot of my life, right? And I was never fully satiated. It felt like continually seeking my next meal, where I was going to get it, what it was going to be, continually being disappointed when I thought I was making healthy choices, and, you know, having a bowl of oatmeal or a fruit smoothie for breakfast and then being hungry again 30 minutes later. And I'm like, what's up with that? That doesn't really make any sense. So since switching over to an animal-based diet, my hunger cues are definitely a lot better. I'm more satiated. I'm not, you know, getting into that hypoglycemic state where I'm, you know, needing something immediately. I'm not having those, you know, spikes of blood sugar and everything. And it's just a much more consistent thing. In fact, I can usually go all day and be like, oh my gosh, right, food, I should probably eat something. So just a completely different thing. And it's been really liberating for me in that I can, you know, eat to live and not live to eat.
Definitely.
For sure. I think I was snack queen prior to this diet. I had all the snacks. I always needed to snack on something. And now, like, it's 4:14 p.m. We haven't eaten today.
Yeah.
And we're fine. Like, I am actually kind of hungry, but it's okay. I can handle it. And actually, something really interesting, before this diet, I would get so hungry that I would get these like stomach cramps. So I remember we had a long drive somewhere, and it was probably around 2 p.m. and I had to like pull over to the side of the road, and I threw up. I was in so much pain because I was hungry. And ever since eating an animal-based diet, I don't get that pain anymore. I fasted for 68 hours. So I don't know what that was. I have no idea, but
experienced that too. I've woken up and felt sick to my stomach because I was so hungry. And like, I didn't know what to do because I'm like, I feel sick and I don't want to eat, but I know that eating is what I need. I don't know if that's just being in like a hypoglycemic state or something like that. But yeah, it was awful. And I've never experienced that since switching over.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, same here. I haven't eaten yet. I'm not hungry yet. I can tell my stomach is empty, but I do not feel any kind of hunger. And it's interesting what you said, Petra. I mean, you're basically talking about being hangry, right? Hangry is like
Yes.
a new, funny thing for people to say when they're hungry these days, which is not something people really talked about in the past. I mean, growing up, when we had less of this processed food, I personally don't remember anyone ever commenting on being in a really bad mood because they're hungry or being hangry. It wasn't really a term back then, but there was this, there's the Food Lies channel. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it on YouTube. There was an MD from the States on it recently who was talking about industrial seed oils. Now I can't remember exactly what the physiologic mechanism was, but she had a pretty reasonable sounding explanation for how, our diets now are very heavy in these oils. Like this is like canola oil. I think vegetable oil is one of them too, heavy in these diets. And she was saying that this may be a culprit in this sort of hangriness that people are experiencing. I don't know, Jay, if you've ever heard of anything like that or if there's any logic to that, but I can link the video in the show notes later.
You're probably talking about Cait Shanahan, I think.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
So she's fantastic. I don't know the physiological mechanism where seed oils would drive hunger, but I certainly think that they are a huge culprit in terms of heart disease, type 2 diabetes. I mean, they directly contribute to the destruction of the cell membrane, which also contributes to the lack of the mitochondria's ability to actually produce energy efficiently. Chris Kenobi is another one who was recently on that podcast, and he did a lecture several years ago at an ancestral health symposium that I was at. And it was so over my head at the time, the biochemistry. And I've probably watched that lecture close to 100 times now. And every time I watch it, I pick up a little bit more and a little bit more. And he quite literally goes through the entire mechanism of how those seed oils cause mitochondrial damage and how in rodent studies, they can actually induce heart failure in as little as 4 weeks. With a high polyunsaturated fatty acid diet. So one of the things that, back to the start of this episode, which was about saturated fat, but in the year 1900, 99% of our added fats to the human diet were of animal origin. Think about that, 99%. And in the 19th century, there were only 8 recorded heart attacks in the literature, 8 in the entire century. So by 2005, we had replaced those animal fats with about 85% seed oil. And of course, heart disease is on the rise. And so, so many other chronic diseases. So again, correlation does not equal causation, but it would seem to me that a food like saturated fat that's been literally around since the dawn of time that we've been consuming without heart disease would somehow be the culprit when we have something that we've introduced to the human food supply so recently is quite literally the single largest human intervention nutritionally ever. We had, in the same century, we had the refining of sugar, flour, and seed oils in the same century. And right after that, we have, chronic disease that we can't even control. So I would think that you would at least, again, the arrow doesn't point to causation, but you would have to look at that seriously. And to me, saturated fat is just completely exonerated as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it has literally nothing to do with it. And we have to start looking elsewhere because it's distracting us from the actual cause.
Yeah. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but like animal products tend to be high in saturated fat and monounsaturated fats, and PUFAs or polyunsaturated fatty acids are a smaller percentage, I think, of animal product fats, right?
Very
Right.
low.
And I think olive oil is a mono, and that's one of the better, plant source oils out there for us to consume, from what I understand.
Right. You want the polyunsaturated fatty acids in nature. They're in very small quantities. I think that's part of the problem, is that in nature they are essential. We have to consume them. So that's where the nuance is, right? Like we need omega-6, we need omega-3, but in too higher quantities, they're very dangerous. So because they just naturally, they were never available in those seed oils the way they are in those seed oils. They were just never available in those quantities. You couldn't eat that much salmon. It's not possible. So monounsaturated fats, because they're more stable than the polyunsaturated fats, and saturated fats are the most stable. So when you're cooking, the only plant oil I ever really tell people to cook with is olive oil. Pretty safe there, but I tell people really simply, just do something like, butter, coconut oil, ghee, lard, something like that. Those are the tallow. Those are the safest fats to cook in, because they're saturated and they can stand the heat. Monounsaturated fats like olive oil have polyphenols to protect them from oxidation, so you can use those. But literally the worst thing you can do is heat a polyunsaturated oil. I mean, I wouldn't consume it cold pressed organic. I don't care what, but heating it is literally the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, and like I think so in North America, our diets are already too high in I think omega-6 fatty acids, which tend to be more pro-inflammatory, right? And then you're adding these PUFAs, these industrial seed oils, and we're worsening the ratio when we actually need to be getting more omega-3s, if anything, right?
Right. A good, they say ancestrally the ratio you want it to be 1-to-1. That's going to be almost impossible today. I mean, I think 4-to-1 and lower, 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1, that's a great, you're doing one hell of a job in this food climate if you can get your omega-6 to 3 ratio 4-to-1. And you can actually get tests, really simple blood tests, like a finger stick test, mail in your results. And I've done it in the past. I think it's super cool and really interesting, and correlates very well with inflammatory markers, and those can change, over several months. So you can make a dietary intervention. You can see what your omega-3 index, what your omega-6 to 3 ratio looks like. But the other thing I would say is, in America, we tend to think, well, if some fish oil is good, that must mean, again, a truckload of it is even better. So what I'm going to do is, instead of removing the omega-6 from the diet, I'm just going to double down on fish oil and get as long as the ratio is right, it can be sky high. But I think that's actually a serious problem, because omega-3s are still easily oxidizable. So they're just as dangerous as omega-6 in terms of oxidation and instability, because it's all about the chemical structure and the double bonds, and that's what makes them unstable. So they're related in that sense. One does drive more inflammation, one does drive more anti-inflammatory cascades, but the goal is to bring the overall concentration down, as well as balancing the ratio. So we just want to consume them in their most, if you consume food in its most natural form, you will naturally have lower, I think it was something like, I want to say 2% of the cellular membrane should be roughly polyunsaturated. Don't quote me on that, but I remember reading a study recently, and in the 50s it crept up to like 10%, and I want to say now we're in some obscene percentage in the 20s or 30s or something, and it damages the cell membrane in it, so it can't do its job any longer. And that's where you start your inflammatory cascade. That's where you start the heart disease process, and everything kind of goes downhill from there. So bringing down the total amounts of polyunsaturated fats, as well as balancing that ratio, are two very important things.
Yeah, and I've seen just with the omega-3, omega-6 ratio and decreasing polyunsaturated fats in the diet, whether you're carnivore or not, that is one of the best, most promising interventions for autoimmune disease. I see the most incredible reversal of symptoms and decreasing of symptoms just simply with that intervention alone. So even if we don't take out all the food groups, but we just really focus on polyunsaturated and omega-6 decreasing, you have instant alleviation of a lot of skin conditions, especially like rheumatic stuff, joint pain, arthritis, all of those things. So really, really important to consider those numbers specifically, and that ratio specifically.
That's really interesting. Do you see that correlate with inflammatory markers, or do you think maybe it just might be just healthier cell membrane structure? Like, does it take time for that to happen?
I think it's healthier membrane structure, because I have definitely seen high inflammation still, but symptoms decreased. So I think it's something that we can't quite spot. Although I'm sure the inflammation definitely plays into it. I think it's more structural. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, you know, we were going to ask too, like, what are the best fats to eat and what are the worst? But we sort of like naturally unpack that in this conversation. But, you know, maybe we can, you know, if anyone sort of wants to contribute there, Jay, if you have anything else to say, specific recommendations, we can definitely go there.
The simple answer to that would be, actually, I think it's Cait Shanahan's quote. She always says, nature doesn't make bad fats, factories do. So just if you're unsure, just simply, and actually, the other important point is a lot of my clients will say, oh, I don't cook in canola oil, or I don't cook in corn oil, so it's fine. But the next thing I say is, okay, now you need to go through every single food you buy, because these are so cheap, they are ubiquitous. So I found them in ketchup. I found them in wild caught salmon. You know, so, right, where you think the only ingredient would be, I don't know, wild caught salmon, but instead, you know, there's, you know, cornstarch and canola oil and all these other things. So, you know, or like traditional dishes, like, so, you know, my background is Mediterranean. So, you know, there are traditional dishes that, like, now say a place like Whole Foods will sell, but instead of being made with traditional oils, which are expensive, they're made with the cheap industrial seed oils. So you can still be eating a whole food technically, but still be getting these oils. So the next thing you need to do is read every single label, because I always tell people the front of the package doesn't tell you anything about how healthy it is. It's always the back. So look at the back of the package, make sure that it's got none of those seed oils, and just look for the real basic ones, you know, the ones, you know, the butters, coconut oil, olive oil, avocado oil, you know, things like that. And stay away from anything that you are unsure of. Canola is not even a real plant. So, you know, there's no such thing as a canola that grows outside. So, you know, just stay away from those things. And I think and also sunflower oil, because that one does trick people up, because they think, oh, sunflowers are real. And I know what a sunflower is, but to get oil from a sunflower seed, you actually really have to go through an intense chemical process, and you have to use an obscene amount of seeds in order, you couldn't possibly eat that many sunflower seeds. So, so just stay away from those factory type oils and just stay with the natural fats, and make sure you're looking at all your ingredients. And I think you're really going to make a huge change overall just by that one intervention.
So, sorry, just to clarify the list for me, like I like hearing them kind of one and then the other. So if we could go over maybe the ones to avoid, like the actual names. So we talked about canola, vegetable oil. You said sunflower oil. What are the other ones that you could name that are typically found?
I have a great chart and not in front of me. So we've got canola oil, we've got sunflower oil, we've got soybean oil, we've got grapeseed oil, we've got
Rapeseed oil.
Yeah.
Rape and rape. So rapeseed
Right.
is actually the real name for canola before it was rebranded.
Right. Margarine is another one, really, you know, and vegetable oil is sort of the catch-all, which I also think is funny. I think that's such a clever marketing term, because there's not a vegetable to be found in any of these oils, by the way.
Okay.
They do not come from vegetables. They actually come from seeds.
I didn't know that was a catch-all term. That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's sort of I think, well, of course, if someone, you know, told you, you know, this rapeseed oil is super heart healthy, it doesn't have exactly the greatest PR campaign behind it. But when you call it a vegetable oil, it just sounds so fantastic that, of course, you know, people used to say to me all the time, well, why isn't a vegetable oil healthy? And, you know, the first thing you have to deconstruct is that it's just not a vegetable. So that's basically the list. The soybean oil, the canola oil, you're going to find in everything. Sunflower oil, you're going to find in everything.
Peanut oil, what about that?
So I don't do peanut oil either. I think it's got a high smoke point, so people tend to use that, but the smoke point doesn't really do it for me, because honestly, avocado oil has a high smoke point, but I still wouldn't cook with it because it's monounsaturated, but it doesn't have the polyphenols to protect it from heat. So I still just stick with like the basic, the olive oil, the butter, the coconut oil, and the lard or tallow. So like, you know, if I kind of keep it to like one hand, I just try to keep it like that. And, you know,
And you
that's
said
sort of like,
ghee too, right?
Ghee, yeah, which is clarified butter. Yeah.
Okay, and then olive oil, you said that it's mono, but it's got the polyphenols, so it
Right.
protects you a bit. Okay.
So I do go with, yeah, that's the only one that I'll really use to cook with, other than
That's
Okay.
interesting. Would you use it for roasting as well? Because I've seen a lot of people in the community, myself included, try to move away from the olive oil if we were to roast vegetables back when I ate them, and instead use something like avocado oil instead, thinking it was the healthier choice. I'm learning now that that's not actually true. So yeah, maybe you could just speak to that. Olive oil is better still?
So there is a little bit of debate. I was of that mind too, and then actually it was James D. Nicolantonio's book that actually changed my perspective on that, and I started to research a little bit. And it seems that the polyphenols working as antioxidants help protect the monounsaturated olive oil, oleic acid, from oxidation when heated. Those are not present in avocado oil. So even though it has a higher smoke point, it is still prone to oxidation more than olive oil. So that's my understanding of it. So that's why I tend to say olive oil is great as a dressing, like a cold, but I also will do some sauteing and cooking in it as well. He even advocates, like, coating and marinating meat in it, because it'll actually help protect the meat as it cooks. Because again, as you know, fats in nature contain all saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat. So it'll actually protect the PUFAs in the meat as well when you cook it. So I think that's still ongoing, but it's a pretty convincing argument to me why olive oil is actually a better choice than avocado oil.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
Jay, how do you
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Petra.
how do you feel about so in Canada we can't get raw butter.
Can, but you have to do it carefully.
Right.
We won't cut that.
This is
We have to
true.
edit that out.
Come and get me.
So, is it the same thing if we consume pasteurized butter?
So do you guys have access to goat butter up there?
Yes, but it's not raw.
Right. So that's interesting. I'd have to think about that. I would still say, if in terms of better or worse, I would still say that would be far better than any seed oil whatsoever, every day of the week. Obviously, raw dairy and raw animal products are better in general, but then the notch below would be, like I'm not sure if Kerrygold butter, if you guys have that up there, or that brand is from Ireland, but it's grass fed. But I don't actually know if it's raw. It's a good question. I don't actually consume a lot of butter myself. The butter I get from a local farm, and it is raw, and it happens to be goat. I find that goat dairy, people tend to do a little bit better with goat and sheep dairy. It just has to do with the proteins inside in the dairy. But that's a good question. I'll have to look into that. I'm not sure, but I would say, if you're going to compare, and it was a choice between like any one of those seed oils and any kind of actual butter, always go for the butter.
For sure.
And I just wanted to add too, for people that are eating out in restaurants, there's basically no way to avoid canola oil in that setting. So even if you're going to the Keg and you're getting a steak, or for the Canadian listeners, the Keg is like the US people, it's this big famous steakhouse that we have here.
Oh.
So even there, like they're using canola oils on their grill. You can go to just about any restaurant of any quality, and that's what they're going to choose to use, because it's the cheapest and the easiest to work with. It doesn't have any flavor. It's got a high smoke point. So all of these reasons that, if you're eating out and you're really trying to avoid that, you need to specifically inquire and ask in the restaurant, what oil are they using? Can they please not cook your steak in canola? Can you cook it in butter instead? Or if they happen to have tallow, like the meters have enlightened me with Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yes.
They fry their chicken wings in tallow, which is
Really
incredible. Like I couldn't believe it when I saw you guys post that, but I ate it last week and they were very good. And you can tell.
Yeah, we called about like 10 places, and it was actually so interesting that the staff there, half the time, they had no idea what kind of oil was used.
Wow.
It's not really that shocking, because a little bit over a year ago, I was cooking with vegetable oil, so I'm not that shocked. But it was actually a fun little experiment where we kept calling, and it's the only place we've been able to find that cooks their chicken wings in beef tallow. So
You know, one of the things you can tell people, I think, especially in today's day and age, because we're so aware of things like peanut allergies and celiac and all these things. So I tell people, use it to your advantage. If you tell a restaurant that you're allergic to vegetable oils, they are not going to question you, and they are going to be sure, because they do not want an incident or a lawsuit or anything. So it might be a little bit of a fib, but I would actually say that we're all allergic to vegetable oil in one way or the other. Our mitochondria hate vegetable oil, and I'm just kind of, you know, doing the bidding of my mitochondria. So if you could please, you know, just make sure you cook this in something else, that would be just fantastic.
Yeah. That's what we say. We say we have severe allergies.
Or food sensitivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they're always like, are you sure you don't want any sauce? Are you sure?
Hey, you want any sauce on the side? I'm like, no, it's perfect as is. Don't worry about it.
It's a great way to do it.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I think that sort of sums up everything that we really wanted to dig into, unless, Jay, you had any golden nuggets or magical sprinklings of anything else that you haven't yet gifted us.
No, all I can say is, you know, the question I ask people all the time is, do you want to be, you know, do you want to be healthy or do you want to be right? So just keep an open mind about everything, please. You know, I definitely came from a whole different school of thought. So going forward, just be open-minded to things. That's what real science is. And the moment we shut off the discussion is the moment that we cease learning. And you know, to me, there's just no progress from there. So you have to get outside your comfort zone, and you have to be, if your ultimate goal is to be healthy, then you just have to be open-minded, and you have to celebrate being incorrect. And I'm incorrect all the time. So I've just gotten used to it. It's okay.
Okay, guys, Jay, thank you so much for joining us. It was by far the best episode yet. And yeah, thank you to the rest of you guys as well. We didn't have to do much talking today, which is nice. So I hope everyone out there enjoyed this new episode of Carnivore Roundtable, and we will see you on the next one when we talk about mental health.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Jay.
Take care, guys.